to the Tech Talks Daily podcast, a place where you can keep informed of the latest business and tech trends by listening to stories of other people in your field and how they are overcoming challenges with emerging technologies. Join me in learning from the guests actionable tips and lessons learned to obtain greater clarity on how you or your business can leverage technology. Now, I have a great guest on the podcast lined up for you today from KPMG, which I'm sure you know by now is a global network of professional firms providing audit, tax, advisory services and much more. And I think they have something like 227,000 outstanding professionals that are working together to deliver value in 146 countries. Well, today's guest is Martin Tiley, and he is a partner and head of UK Cyber at KPMG. And after reading in KPMG's last UK CEO Outlook survey, this mouth-watering stat that 81% of leaders said that protecting their partner's ecosystem and supply chain is just as important as building their own organisation's cyber defences, I felt compelled to get him on the podcast and explore that survey and also the landscape in which he's working in much more detail. So buckle up and hold on tight, because I'm going to beam your ears all the way to Manchester here in the UK, where you can join me and Martin in conversation. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Martin. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Neil. So my name is Martin Tiley. I'm a partner at KPMG, who people probably often associate as one of the big four accountancy firms, but I sit in the consultancy part of that organisation. I'm in the UK and I lead our cybersecurity practice, which is it's a few hundred people. Our home is Manchester in the north of England, but from here I can work with clients pretty much across the globe. And at the last count, I visited just over 30 countries in my 22 years here. And really simply what we do is bring the content that exists in other parts of our firm, in some of the teams, maybe our forensic team or another part of our technology practice, together with technology solutions and platforms to deliver great outcomes for our clients. That's me in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Sounds like you're incredibly busy there and knocked up some air miles throughout the years. I'm curious, what kind of countries have you been visiting in a work capacity? Is it Europe, US, or beyond?
It's a real mix. If I go back right to the start, one I've been in the firm just a couple of months, and I was asked to work in Hong Kong for 5 months at the start of the .com boom. So just over 20 years ago, that was incredible.
Yeah,
it really was. More recently, my focus, probably because of the organisations I'm working with, has more been in the US and across Europe. So that's where I've spent most of my time recently.
And when you went to Hong Kong 20 years ago, was that landing into the legendary airport as well? Because I know it was closing around about that time.
It just closed. No, it had just closed. I heard many tales of people who'd flown in between those buildings to land. But no, by the time I got there, the airport was out on Lantau Island.
I love that. And fast forward to 2022, one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast was I was reading in KPMG's last UK CEO Outlook survey that 81% of leaders have said that protecting their partner ecosystem and supply chain is just as important as building their own organisation's cyber defences. Can you offer an overview of that report and what that stat means to you? Because it's quite a mouth-watering one, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And sometimes when we send the surveys out, we know exactly what's going to, we have a really good idea of what's going to come back. And sometimes the results do surprise us. And you're right. In the last survey, 81% said protecting that partner ecosystem and supply chain is just as important. And we think we understand, having dug into that a bit more, why, because almost 3/4 of them responded to say that in the last 3 years, they'd suffered at least one significant disruption caused by a third party. And so I think there's a direct correlation there between what's actually happening in organizations who maybe have spent a lot of their time historically focused on how to protect themselves and are realizing now that their vulnerability exists with that ecosystem of other organizations that are so important to them.
And it's not just about the cyber attacks as well. I'm curious because it's such a complex world. Do you think that as enterprises continue to prioritise the digital transformation of just about everything, do you think sharing data throughout a complex and connected ecosystem of partners and suppliers is just going to get more convoluted?
Look, I think as more and more data and systems move into the cloud, it is going to get more convoluted in some ways.
Yeah.
However, that data journey can be managed and it can be protected and monitored and reported in ways that previously we couldn't do, because technology is allowing much more control over the management of an organization's data now. And I think the other good piece of good news is we remind people all of the time is that unlike technology that was designed, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, today, security is pre-packaged into almost everything, and certainly into software as a service and cloud solutions. And be really clear, that doesn't mean it's switched on by default. So it still requires planning and some thought, but there's really sophisticated cyber tooling built into many digital solutions that people and organizations are already paying for, but potentially maybe they're not using.
And another big topic, of course, I'd love for you to expand on is why existing vetting processes for suppliers have traditionally required tremendous and perhaps infeasible amounts of due diligence by every single ecosystem partner. And do you think some of those existing approaches just aren't fit for purpose anymore? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think you're right. For smaller organizations in particular, this can be really painful and absolutely critical, to them in those first few years. How to frame this? Imagine for a moment you and I are asked to observe 10 people in a soundproofed environment where we can't hear them and they can't hear us. They're all dressed as they would for a normal day, and they're all broadly a similar age. Some are shorter or taller, others may look like runners or couch potatoes, some might look tired and others full of energy. And then we're asked to rank them 1 to 10 in terms of their overall health, and specifically whether or not we feel they might have any health issues in the next 5 years. Now, I know I would struggle with that, and even a trained doctor would.
Yeah.
And to do that with any confidence, they would point out that you'd need a full medical. You'd have to ask some questions on lifestyle and diet, on exercise. You'd maybe run some tests, perhaps take some blood samples. And maybe if you want even more scrutiny, you'd have an MRI scan to really know what's going on inside each of those people to understand their health. Well, it's the same for any supplier or organization that we want to work with, where we want confidence that over the same 5-year period, let's say, that organization is going to remain in good financial and operational health. So the outside signs might look good. Their website, let's say client testimonials on their website, or a CEO with a really good track record. But until we ask questions, until we do some testing of our own, our equivalent of blood tests or an MRI scan, it's hard to know really what risks lie within those organizations. So for an organization with thousands of suppliers, it simply isn't feasible to run thousands of tests. So we do have to think about other ways of doing this and rely on other indicators for suppliers that perhaps aren't in our highest risk categories, relying on reports or tests that others have recently undertaken, and maybe an independent badge or a seal of potential health, or talking to other customers of that supplier to understand their track record. So I've got a lot of sympathy on either side. In terms of what existing approaches need to change, there are still many that rely solely on a point-in-time assessment approach, and taking a blanket approach by asking every supplier the same set of questions. The amount of time, effort, and resources for the organisation and suppliers is tremendous. In our experience, suppliers will fall broadly into sort of 3 groups. You've got those who cooperate the first time around, hopefully as many as possible. There's then going to be a group who might provide some challenge. Why do you need to know this piece of information, for example? And there are going to be some, hopefully a smaller number, but they will exist, who will resist any vetting process. And in the end, whether they do or not could come down to who the larger player is in that negotiation, in that contract. Now, we know of organisations that themselves are sizable, have been on month-long journeys going back and forth with suppliers to get them to provide the right responses. So it is difficult, but you're absolutely right. We do need to think about different ways of managing this.
And I'm conscious you're in a very fortunate position. You're going to be speaking to people on both sides of that fence. And from those conversations, is there a real thirst and an appetite for change? And maybe there is a better way of doing things?
Yeah, we've seen that. We see the appetite for change in the conversations I have with organizations every day. But it's one of the questions we asked in the survey. And just over three quarters, 77%, of respondents said that they realized their existing programs of how they manage third-party risk needed to be updated and incorporate more proactive responses. So recognizing this, what we're doing in 2022 may not be the right answer next year or the year after that. And understanding that is really important. And I don't know about you, Neil, but if I look back, even in the last 10 years at things like my diet, well, it just keeps shifting all the time as we learn more about what's good for us in moderation and how diet can impact everything from weight to sleep. But it's the same for our clients and for any organization when it's looking at the ecosystem and the suppliers that are out there and the threats that are relevant to them. Now, broadly, what do I mean by that, by the sort of the threats and the threat environment? We've mapped out around 13 ways that any organization could become a victim of a cyber attack or a cyber event. Now, every quarter we revisit them based on everything that we're seeing, and almost always we make small changes so that over time, over a few years, the priorities will shift quite a bit as to where we need to place our defenses. Understanding who those groups are that might be seeking to, launch an attack, how their techniques are changing, and then relating that back to how we ourselves are managed is the basis of taking a threat-led approach. And it's that threat-led approach that we talk about a lot, the organizations that we're helping with here. So when you know that you can put the right, when you know that you're going to take that approach, you can then put the right building blocks in place in order to be more proactive.
And another shift that I've seen in my IT career is that shift again from a reactive approach to things like compliance, risk and cybersecurity to a more proactive approach. So the big question for you, I guess, is how can CISOs listening better transition away from a compliance-based strategy to a much more proactive approach?
There are a few building blocks in that for me, and some of them involve technology and some of them are more about just our way of thinking about how can we potentially also take a role in supporting those around us as well. So, and first off, I do believe that, and this will vary in different countries, but there is a collaboration model between public and private sector and operational structures that we have seen in some countries work really well. So where that public-private partnership exists, there are ways of detecting and disrupting criminal activity at pace, and there are certain environments around the world that are doing that really well. Second, for me, within the organization, having an easy to use and a well understood risk management, approach and a framework, a consistency around language. When we're talking about this, a common way of talking about risk is really important. Even around, we see use of words like critical or catastrophic, words that we assume mean certain things. But they might shift slightly differently in organizations. Language is really important as well. The next one, you talked about moving away from compliance. Now, there is clearly a role for compliance still, and understanding which controls are operating and which aren't is really important. And some regulators expect us to be able to report on that as well. We've already said that IT environments are getting more and more complex. So my third point is about embracing artificial intelligence or machine learning in ways that controls that are being tested can allow your measurement to expand at the same pace as your technology. So as things shift, you just are able to monitor and observe more. Next one is around moving away from a point-in-time assessment. Continuous controls monitoring has been talked about for decades. And today, especially in newer technologies, it's much easier to set up and get working. The idea of a point-in-time monitoring, I used to think of as a little bit like a lighthouse. You imagine that light slowly circling 360 degrees. And for maybe 1 or 2 days of a year, we shine that light really brightly on a supplier. And then for 51 weeks, we go dark. Well, intrinsically, we know that doesn't make sense. But until recently, having the tools to work around this so that we're monitoring completely wasn't as easy. And then the last one for me is I would encourage all organizations to adopt a more active approach to building ecosystem security. So larger, more resourceful organizations, well, they've got an opportunity to take a lead by applying security measures to protect their suppliers as well, in addition to their own environment, i.e. they can help their suppliers work through what's important through education. So I appreciate there's a bit to unpack there, but I think it's collaboration, language, technology, including continuous assessment, and then that ecosystem and sharing of good practice. They're the building blocks for me that will go a long way to feeling much more confident around how these risks can be managed.
And I suspect so much of what you just said will resonate with people listening all over the world. And for business leaders listening, are there any recommendations or additional recommendations you'd pass on that could be listening to our conversation today and they want to overcome all the challenges that we're discussing here?
I think that the tone from the top is really important in any organization. Certainly when I started my career, I would always be talking to the person responsible for information security. Way back when, it could be the IT security manager. Nowadays, the chief information security officer or the chief security officer in an organization. But understanding, where the biggest influencers and decision makers are in that organization and getting them on side and in support, I think is absolutely critical. So whether that's at an exco level or on the boardroom, educating that group of individuals who have the most influence out across the organization, I think is really important. And often, especially in a boardroom where perhaps some of the people are, only focused on that organization for a few weeks of the year, that education to explain that in this area of kind of cyber risk, looking back, isn't often the best indicator of what needs to be done further down the road. That's an ongoing program of education. So boardrooms, and able to ask the question, those that are looking at a multi-year strategy and not just the next 12 months, where that senior team has got that skills matrix where gaps are known and they have the right expertise at hand when they need it. And then boards that are being educated and briefed on their own reliance of their ecosystem. So they're not only focused in that organization. If you can get that right tone at the top, get those people bought in to what you need to do and that it's all in support of that organization and its strategy, I think that would be the single biggest differentiator that I see for those that manage this really well in the organizations I work with.
And you did mention there boardrooms, and traditionally boardrooms have had a reputation for not being able to see the value in things like cybersecurity and often think, why would I want to invest so much money in something that may not happen? And I'm curious, do boardrooms fully comprehend the need for a more active approach to building an ecosystem security, or is there still a little resistance? What are you seeing there?
I feel sometimes with boardrooms, we're kind of in the foothills of getting to a stage where we've got that confidence right across the boardroom. But I have seen this shift more in the last 3 or 4 years than certainly in the previous 10 or 15. And that we are seeing significant shifts in capability and understanding in multiple boardrooms right now. So most boardrooms have some pretty incredible talent and experience across a whole range of areas. It could be operations, finance, often people with a legal background as well. And for me, the best boardrooms are where there's not just one person who sits on there with an understanding of technology or resilience, privacy or cyber risk, but actually it's where the education has gone right across the boardroom. So each of those people with their finance, operations, legal background, they bring their own understanding of the operation of that organization, of the other risks that it has, and then apply what they understand now about cyber risk. And what happens then is the entire board is then involved in that conversation. And it's more insightful, it's giving much greater support and challenge to the CISO or the person in that organization that's responsible for leading in this space. Even in some boardrooms, we've seen them run through simulations. So actually a shared experience of what would happen if. and then painting out those scenarios. It might be a supplier challenge. It might be something in logistics. It might be, something in, loss of physical facilities or something else. Running through those scenarios, doing that as a collective experience just lifts the empathy and the understanding of that boardroom so significantly. So yeah, I do see some great examples, and I'm optimistic that that's the direction we're heading in more boardrooms now.
And we have talked a lot about the challenges and how to overcome them. And with all this in mind, what makes you hopeful or maybe even excited about the future and the road ahead?
I'm hopeful for a number of reasons. I like to think I'm glass half full. Anyway, certainly one thing I would say, and it's not often people say they feel confident about regulation when regulation comes in, but let me say this. Most regulation that we see coming into this space now, asking organizations to consider their resilience, asking them to consider their supply chain, is principles based as opposed to being prescriptive and requiring certain controls. Now, where I'm based in the UK, I'd say that's been led by financial services. So they're a great example where in the last couple of years, they've been asked to ask really difficult questions of themselves to determine their own risk appetite. And there's this pivot, this shift towards cyber resilience in that focus. And I think that's been really healthy. So take financial services. Organizations now are required to understand, what is my minimum viable bank or my minimum viable organization? So the thousands of things that I do, which are the most critical? Maybe the 30 or the 40 where more than 24 hours of downtime of not being in operation could be disastrous for any one of a number of different reasons. When you ask those kind of questions and you go through that process of understanding that, it takes away all of that noise and stripping it down to those things that are most critical. So suddenly that becomes a challenge and something that's more achievable. I'm also optimistic as I see organizations learn much more about the risks that they have, which are perhaps shared across an industry. So one survey that we saw around 18 months ago, around 2/3 of UK organizations use the same 4 cloud providers for cloud infrastructure services.
Yeah.
And so that changes the question. For them, it becomes an industry question and actually an opportunity to collaborate as opposed to one of competitive advantage where they're working on their own. And when organizations then start to collaborate around how do we ensure that there remains confidence in this industry, not just in our own organization, and you get that into a room, a virtual one or a real one, perhaps with the regulator, then we can see things move really quickly and just, really powerful sharing experiences between them of how best to respond. So I think principles-based regulation, I think industries and groups that increasingly share. And then the one I said earlier on, technology and modern technology today that has so much of the tooling we need to protect ourselves already built in. There are definitely reasons to feel more optimistic.
Now, we started the podcast talking about your origin story, what put you on this path. And as we've come full circle, if we look back throughout your career, I think none of us are able to achieve success without a little help along the way. So with that in mind, as we reflect on your career, is there a particular person that you're grateful towards or someone you just want to give a shout out to who played a bit of a part in helping you get where you are today?
I've been really lucky in my career. If I think about the first few people I reported to, the managers, and I'm even going back to those I had over 20 years ago, I'm still in touch with them. And also I got to work with them for many years as well. But if I'm going to choose one person, it would actually be someone I met around 5 years ago. So you can't see this on the podcast, but I'm a white male. I'm in my 40s. And when I joined the organization and I sat in the room with the rest of my team, when the partners were in the room and I was having a conversation with them, not once did I look around and think there's no one here who looks like me. Yeah. So 5 years ago, I was introduced to somebody called Roberta. And Roberta and I were part of a Black Heritage reverse mentoring scheme. And the purpose of the scheme was to educate partners and people like myself in leadership positions in the organization by pairing us with men and women of Black heritage who are typically at a more junior level in the organization. In Roberta's case, our age difference was about 20 years. And Roberta opened my eyes to a number of things that I just hadn't given enough thought to, and really shifted my perspective on the importance of building diverse teams and understanding, when you are doing that, some of the challenges that will come along the way. So, for example, I have never in my time in this organization had to pretend that I enjoy a certain hobby, cricket or football or something else. In every room, as I said, I've been in, there's always been somebody there who looked like me. I never really get asked, where are you from? And when I give the answer of Manchester, no one has ever said to me, yes, but where are you really from? And the list of examples just went on and on and on. In talking to Roberta, we worked together for 18 months in the end. We met every 2 weeks. I introduced her to about 20 peers of mine across the partnership, and she did into our African Caribbean network as well, where I went and spoke about what I recognized was the privilege that I'd had in those early years of my career, never having to worry about fitting in. And that, for me, was a real change. It was a real moment of reflection, and we're still in touch. Roberta is fantastic and having an amazing career, and we've continued to run that program here. And it's kind of a reminder for me, when I'm so busy working with my clients, recruiting, doing everything else that I'm doing in my life, that looking at the world and looking everything around me through a different pair of eyes is really, really important lesson.
It really is, and such a powerful answer there. So thank you so much for sharing that with me today. And before I let you go, for anyone listening that would like to find out more information about the report or the work that you do, or contact you or your team, what's the best starting point for everything?
Really simple. So we go to the KPMG UK website, and I'd like to think you can click through to our cybersecurity practice really quickly from there. Search me out on LinkedIn under my name, Martin Tiley. I'd be delighted to hear questions or comments from anyone who's got any more questions. Very much see what we do in the area that we work in, and that was sort of responsibility for educating is I love that part of my role. So I'd be delighted to chat through with anyone who gets in touch.
Well, we started the podcast today talking about that powerful stat that 81% of leaders said that protecting their partner ecosystem and supply chain is equally as important as building their own organisation's cyber defence. Is such a powerful moment. But then, given the high-profile supply chain cyber attacks seen last year, maybe it's not too much of a surprise. But more than anything, I've just loved hearing about your very powerful story and insights from that report. So a big thank you for sharing that with me today.
Thank you.
After our recording today, Martin told me that he had listened to many interviews on this podcast over the years, but today he found himself on the show. But that leaves one more box to tick, Martin. Don't think you're done now. And that box is, of course, to have a cold beer or a hot coffee with me in Manchester next time I'm there. So I will be looking you up. And for everyone else listening, you've heard Martin's story today and the intriguing insights from that survey and what he's seeing in the industry. But I want to hear your story too. So if Martin can go from listener to guest, I will simplify and make that transition easy for you too. Have no fear, you are in safe hands. So if you'd like to come on the podcast, or you've got a question or anything that you'd like to share, you know how to find me. I know that every podcast you listen to will have a message from your host telling you to please leave a rating and review. But in a world where we're all ruled by algorithms, it really does help the show reach more listeners. So please, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a review. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow, but a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.